Auzubillahiminash-shaytanir-rajim. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Already I have explained you about collective security system of the United Nations with reference of Korean War. And today's discussion is about with the reference of Gulf War or Iraq Kuwait War of 1991 and role of the United Nations and application of collective security measures. The West Asian region witnessed one of the worst crises of recent history in the form of Gulf War in January and February 1991, when Iraq was invaded by 28 countries led by the United States. The basic reasons of this war or this crisis was that Iraq forcefully occupied Kuwait on 2nd August 90 and made it the 9th province of Iraq. The trouble started because Kuwait was exerting oil in excess of the quota, which led to the depression of oil prices and reduction in Iraq's earnings. Further, Kuwait refused to give up two islands of Warba and Bobeyan and territories occupied by it close to Iraq's unmarked borders. Another factor which greatly become the cause of tension and war and crisis between Iraq and Kuwait was Rumaila oil fields. Iraq accused Kuwait of stealing oil field, which resulted in loss to the millions dollars at the prices prevailing between 1980 and 90. Efforts by various Arab countries to resolve differences between Iraq and Kuwait failed to produce any results. Faced with the difficult financial problems due to long-drawn war with Iran, President Saddam Hussein of Iraq took the extreme step of forcible occupation of Kuwait. In the light of these reasons, this war started. Iraq's aggression against Kuwait evoked strong reactions from all parts of the world. The United Nations Security Council passed a number of resolutions asked Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait and restore sovereignty to Kuwait. It also called upon the member countries to impose economic and military sanctions against Iraq. United States even went beyond the scope of the Security Council resolution and arranged a naval blockade in the hope that Iraq would wilt under the force of such sanctions and agree to pull out its forces from Kuwait. But as the sanctions were imposed half-heartedly, they failed to achieve the desired results. In this situation, the Security Council tried its best and Security Council gave an ultimatum to withdraw forces from Kuwait by 15th January 1991, failing which the United Nations member states would be obliged to use necessary measures to secure the objective. Saddam Hussein, on the other hand, linked the issue of withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait with the establishment of a new state of Palestine with Jerusalem as its capital. He also refused to accept the dates for talks dictated by the United States. As a result, war became necessary and imminent. Certain countries made last minute bid to prevent hostilities, but their efforts did not yield the desired results. On the expiry of the deadline, forces of 28 nations led by United States started air onslaughts on Iraq. Though the main aim of the United Nations resolution was to secure liberation of Kuwait from Iraqi occupation and restore integrity, unity, and sovereignty of this small state, the main objective of the leading Western powers became to topple Saddam Hussein and break up Iraq so that it may not be able to pose any threat to Western supremacy. The public opinion in the most of the countries, including certain parts of USA, turned hostile to USA for attacking Iraq. Saddam Hussein bravely withstood the air raids by the forces of 28 countries for quite some time, even launched attacks against Israel and Saudi Arabia with Soviet supplied Scud missiles. The war finally come to an end on 28 February 1991 when Iraq conveyed to acceptance of all the 12 resolutions passed by the Security Council. The Gulf War was unique in many ways. In the first instance, coalition of three nuclear powers was for the first time involved in this war in military action against a country, while the other two supported the war. England and America acted in perfect unionism, while France supported the war on the persuasion that it was being waged to liberate an occupied country. Two other nuclear powers, China and Russia, also supported the war tactfully. In fact, Soviet Union put the entire blame for the tragic turn of Gulf War on Iraq. The second important aspect of this war was that in this war, a large number of Arab and non-Arab Islamic countries extended support to United States against Iraq, an Arab Muslim country. It is noteworthy that neither of the two superpowers could secure the support of such a large number of Asian countries in any of the wars waged by them earlier. America in earlier. Role of America also cannot be denied in this war. Thirdly, for the first time, all the permanent members of the Security Council acted with unanimity, and all the 12 resolutions on the Persian Gulf crisis were adopted by the Security Council without any veto. This is very important point of our discussion, that first time all the permanent members of the Security Council acted unanimously, and 12 resolutions regarding this crisis were adopted by the Security Council without any veto. Next important point of regarding in this crisis was a warning period of 5 months before hostilities actually started. This is in complete contrast with some of the earlier wars which were started rather abruptly. Next point, the Persian Gulf War was not a United Nations war against Iraq. The Security Council merely gave permission for use of all available means to make Iraq withdraw from Kuwait. Unlike the Korean War of 1950, when all the forces were placed under the United Nations command with the United Nations flag, the Persian Gulf War was fought under the leadership of United Nations, but role of Security Council in this crisis cannot be denied. Role of Secretary General also cannot be denied to maintain peace and security. And next important point was, this war was unique in the sense that it caused damage to the civilian population and civilian economy on an unprecedented scale. Further important point regarding this war was that in this war, environment was used as a war weapon. The massive slicks of oils let out by Iraq into the sea not only posed serious problems for Saudi Arabia and other allies, but also resulted in the death of thousands of birds, fish, and other living things in the sea. Iraq deliberately dumped crude in the sea to hamper naval operations and foul up desalination plants supplying drinking water. Next important point of this war was that this war witnessed history's most intense bombing campaign. A relatively small territory of Iraq was plastered with a large number of more powerful laser guided bombs. The bombs dropped during this war were far in excess of the bombs drops in the Nazi occupied Europe during the entire Second World War. Next most important point of this war or this crisis was that in this war, the countries which bore the financial burden of the war did not play any effective role in the planning or in different directions of the war, while major finances for the war were contributed by the Arab and other countries. The planning, executions, and direction of the war was left with the United States. Overall, while discussing Iraq Kuwait crisis or Iraq Kuwait war, now I explain you about different impacts of war and future trends of this region. This war had a deep impact on almost all the countries of the world, especially the countries of the third world. On 4th April 1991, the 5 permanent members of Security Council adopted a resolution which required Iraq to accept UN control in violation of its rights as a sovereign nation. Some of the restrictions imposed on Iraq relate to acquisition of weapons, pursuit of a peaceful nuclear capability, and change in its borders with Kuwait. What is really painful that no such restrictions have been imposed on other countries in the region. This is a cause of great concern to all the third world countries because under the currently accepted international norms, every country has the right to safeguard its territory and to acquire whatever weaponry it needs either through purchase or through other arrangements. The Persian Gulf War, though initially provided new lease of life to the United Nations, has rendered it virtually powerless. Soon after the occupation of Kuwait by Iraq, the UN Security Council passed a series of resolutions which were adopted with the support of all permanent members, but it did not show any keenness to ensure their earnest implementations. In fact, President Bush of USA virtually pushed the Security Council to the background and assumed the powers of a world superpower. Further, the US-led multinational forces resorted to bombing of civilian areas in clear violation of international law. All this gave the impression that the United Nations was merely convenient fowl in the hands of USA. Or in other words, we can very easily explain here that supremacy or dominant role of USA in the United Nations can be traced during this crisis. Next, most important point regarding the impacts of war is the Gulf War highlighted the need of effective regional organizations to prevent external military intervention. In this war, America and her allies were able to make effective intervention because the existing regional organization of this area, for example, Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Conference, failed to play any effective role in resolving differences, conflicts between Iraq and Kuwait. So, Arab League and OIC failed to resolve this conflict. Had they acted effectively, there would have been no need for external military intervention. Instead, the countries of this region preferred to support United States and her allies. This greatly reduced their importance and they could hardly play any role in the planning, execution or direction of war. This participation in the war was confined only to financial contributions and oil supplies. Next, further most important aspect of this crisis was that the limited role played by Soviet Union during the Persian Gulf War was a clear pointer that it was too deeply involved in its domestic problems and was not willing to play a dominant role which it once used to play. Although Soviet Union had been Iraq's most helpful friend and major suppliers of weapons, it preferred to keep its hands off. It voted for the US sponsored resolutions in the Security Council that authorized all necessary means to deal with Gulf crisis. However, Soviet Union did not join the Allied forces in the war against Iraq. For the major part of war, Soviet leaders maintained silence. However, towards the close of war, Gorbachev put forth a peace plan for ending the war. It has been urged that had Soviet Union played more effective role and taken a little stronger stand during the war, the United States would not have been able to dominate and dictate the course of events. This war also greatly enhanced the influence of the Western countries in the oil rich region of West Asia. This point is very important, and this point also indicated different events, different crises, conflicts, and role of superpowers in this region due to the oil resources. Now the Western countries can be sure of the unhindered supply of the oil because the refining activities are mainly controlled by the Western countries. Even though her production is confined in the hands of national oil companies, the Western countries shall also be able to greatly influence the prices of oil. So, rich oil resources also remained not only in history, in present, and remain also in future a major cause of involvement of major powers in this region. The Gulf War also demonstrated that the developed and powerful countries can cooperate with each other whenever their interests remain common or for their common interests. In fact, one of the major considerations for the intervention of the advanced Western countries in this region during the Gulf War was protection of their oil interest, and it is very clear to resolve this crisis due to for the protection of their own interest. It would have acquired control over 20% of world's oil reserves, which would have certainly operated against the interest of advanced Western countries. In the post-Gulf War period, United States played a more dominated role in this region, and United States continue its involvement in this region. Naturally, the Arab looked towards United States for all economic and military aid or assistance. America also benefited because the Arabs are placing orders for sophisticated weapons for their stocks. The task of reconstruction of the war, and like the countries like the Kuwait and Iraq, also brought financial benefits to American and other Western countries. It is true that United States has substantially reduced its reliance on Middle East oil, but Still, it has keen interest in the Persian Gulf on account of its strategic importance and as a last resort for supply of oil on account of its excess production capacity. During this discussion, there are also many. In the result of this crisis, there were also many crises and complications occurred in this region. And in October 1994, a new mini crisis arose in Persian Gulf involving Iraq and Kuwait on the one hand and its western allies on the other. Interest, this crisis was a continuation of larger Gulf crises of 1990 and 91, in which the US led coalition forces and defeated Iraq and liberated Kuwait. One of the terms of settlement of Gulf crisis of 1991 was imposition of embargo on oil sales by Iraq. The oil embargo, in terms of United Nations Security Council resolution, was to be lifted after Iraq was disarmed of its mass destruction weapons and had no longer the capacity to make them again, except with limited range. While the United Nations inspectors in Iraq were about to issue a favorable report on Iraq's cooperation, and Iraq was close to obtaining permission to resume oil exports, President Saddam Hussein committed the mistake of sending 80,000 troops near the Iraqi border, which were immediately exploited by US, and it immediately sent a strong force of Marines and different plans. USA along with UK pleaded for the tightening of sanctions against Iraq, and the United Nations committed itself to sanctions afresh. The crisis was averted due to withdrawal of troops from Kuwaiti border by the Iraqi president. It may be very necessary to understand that though US was keen to take military action against Iraq, Russia, France and China did not favor such an action. In November 1994, Iraq accorded formal recognition to Kuwait as a sovereign state and dropped all territorial claims, which led to invasion of Kuwait by Iraq in 1990. Iraq took this decision in the hope that the Security Council would lift the sweeping sanctions imposed against her after its attack on Kuwait in August 90. However, the Security Council refused to lift the sanctions against Iraq. In view of the adverse effect of economic sanctions and embargo on the health, nutrition, education, and general condition of the people of Iraq, certain countries also pleaded for lifting of economic sanctions and embargo on oil sales. In view of all this, the United Nations Security Council approved a plan which permitted Iraq to sell oil to buy food, medicine, and other supplies for its people's sufferings due to United Nations sanctions. In terms of this plan, Iraq was allowed to sell up to $2 billion worth of oil over 180 days under the United Nations supervision. But it was to set aside part of the profits to pay for the United Nations weapons inspection teams and as reparation to Kuwait and victims of the Gulf War. As per the plan, Iraq could earn 51 billion every 3 months through oil sale, which was to be first credited to an account maintained by the United Nations Secretary General, who was to then directly distribute $130 million as relief to Iraqi Kurds and $3,000 million as war reparation to those in the neighboring countries and pay remaining $670 million to the supplies of food and medicines to the Iraqis. However, the plan was rejected by President Saddam on 15th April 1995 on the ground that it is infringed her sovereignty. Overall, if we examine whole circumstances of Iraq and Kuwait crisis, then we find out that role of United Nations in this crisis and collective action and different resolutions and different steps taken by the Security Council were about the promotion of maintenance for the peace and security all over the world, not only in the region but also for the all over the world. While concluding this topic, one point which I have already repeated in my last lecture, that point is, and that point is very clear that uh, in this crisis, in this Kuwait-Iraq wars, United Nations tried its best, Security Council tried its best to secure the integrity, sovereignty, independence of Kuwait, and Iraq was declared aggressor, and Iraqi occupation on Kuwait was totally violation of international organizations, violation of United Nations Charter, and violation of international law. But another important point also, uh, very important, very central point of this discussion, and that is that major role of major powers, particularly hegemonic role of USA in this region, very easily can be traced and very easily can be studied for her own vested interest due to oil resources of the region. And that is the end of our today's discussion. Allah Hafiz.